This episode of New Politics was released on the 1st of July, 2023, and produced on the land of the Wongal and Whadjuk people.
Welcome to New Politics. In this episode, the New South Wales ICAC releases its findings on the former New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian and decides that there's a lot of serious corruption involved. The Russian Federation almost falls apart, but there was no one from the Australian media to report on it. Remembering Simon Crean in his position on the war in Iraq. And opinion polls are suggesting Australia is heading in the wrong direction. Could this be a problem for the Labor government? I'm Eddie Djokovic, editor of New Politics.
I'm David Lewis. Just wait for my ICAC report to come out.
And if you'd like to support New Politics, you can support us through a Patreon subscription, but whether it's a subscription or whether you just want to listen in, read our material online or buy a t-shirt or buy a book, it's all available at newpolitics.com.au, and all of this is a good way to support independent journalism. The New South Wales Independent Commission Against Corruption has released its findings into the actions of former Premier Gladys Berejiklian and former Member of New South Wales Parliament Daryl Maguire, and found that both engaged in serious corruption and that the former Premier breached public trust over her support for a grant to the Australian Clay Target Association and the building of a hall for the Riverina Conservatorium of Music. It's also recommended that the public prosecutor lay charges against Daryl Maguire, but not Gladys Berejiklian, and that's for advancing his own financial interest by brokering land deals and setting up a visa scheme, which could also have ramifications for some federal Liberal Party ministers as well. So it's taken almost 2 years for these findings to be made, but after all the high-level criticisms that were thrown at the ICAC by the former Prime Minister Scott Morrison and the former New South Wales Coalition government, and all the support that was being provided by the mainstream media at the time by suggesting that Gladys Berejiklian was a woman in love done over by a bad boyfriend, it's been well worth the wait, I think.
It's definitely been well worth the wait. Those of us who watch New South Wales closely knew that there was something rotten going on. We didn't quite know what, but the dodgy buildings, the roads that went nowhere, the strange projects that didn't seem to have much sense nor reason to them, it showed that we were justified in our suspicions. It's been a long road. During the pandemic, where I think at least 3/4 of Sydney was glued to the television watching Gladys Berejiklian's cross-examination and watching her come to the realisation that, maybe I have done something wrong. And the cool and calm forensic questioning of counsel assisting the inquiry was just incredible television. And now we have a 600-page report. It seems to be a masterclass in how to present evidence to the only conclusion that it could be. The other thing, I guess, is that the usual suspects, right-wing media, have jumped up and defended Gladys and saying that she's hardly done by. Thing is that they haven't recommended charges. They did recommend charges against Daryl Maguire and a couple of other people, but it doesn't look like Gladys will be referred to the Department of Public Prosecutions.
Although they haven't recommended charges against Gladys Berejiklian, the report is quite scathing. She should have acted as soon as it was obvious that there was something quite wrong. I think that it was obvious that she knew that something was quite wrong as well.
Okay, that sounds fun.
Yeah, I've been doing my books, my accounts.
Yeah.
Counting my tax refund.
Good.
That's excellent.
Given the size of it, it'll take you all week to count it all.
It's true. And the good news is William tells me we've done our deal. So hopefully that's about half of all that gone now.
That's good. I don't need to know about that bit.
No, you don't.
Yeah.
And that's the infamous I don't need to know about that recording, where even someone who knows nothing at all about New South Wales politics or knows who Gladys Berejiklian is or who Daryl Maguire is, they probably would have listened to that and thought, well, there's something seriously wrong going on here, and that doesn't sound right for a Premier of New South Wales to say something like that. And there was something wrong that was going on. There was some serious corruption going on, and as the New South Wales ICAC has found, it was all covered up. There was the secrecy of the relationship, and we're also not talking about small sums of money. It was $20 million for the Conservatorium of Music, $5.5 million for the Clay Target Association, and just like Eddie Obeid and Ian MacDonald in the previous New South Wales Labor government, they thought that they would just get away with it. And this is also the highest level of corruption against the New South Wales Premier, and it's the third New South Wales Premier found to be corrupt by the New South Wales ICAC. All of them have been from the Liberal Party, and you could argue that there probably wasn't much for the first two New South Wales Premiers. Nick Greiner was found to be corrupt on a technicality, and that was overturned later on. Barry O'Farrell resigned over not declaring an expensive bottle of red wine as a donation, and there were other reasons involved which we won't get into, otherwise we might get sued. But this is so brazen and so over the top. New South Wales politics is quite dirty and quite corrupt, but even still, it's hard to believe that it was so brazen and they thought that they would actually get away with it.
I think there's a level in which I don't know if it's complacency, and I'm sure some of our listeners are already vigorously shaking their head. I don't know if it is ignorance that everybody else has done this, so it might be the right way, and that's probably just set off another lot of our listeners vigorously shaking their heads.
Well, as long as we don't get those email attacks every single day, that's the most important thing.
I've already started mine, so, And the other thing, I guess, is that it could be that they knew about it, but were so not worried about the consequences. I mean, Gladys cut the funding of ICAC when another one of her ministers was under the gun. His case is still open, I think. It's a big and complex case. But to blatantly cut the funding at such an obvious time, which they didn't do when Eddie Obeid was being investigated, and neither should they have. In a sense, the story of Gladys Berejiklian is one of the great Australian political tragedies, in that it go all the way up to when she becomes Premier. And you have what could be a really inspirational story. Couldn't speak English when she went to school, ends up being school captain and going to university, getting involved in the Liberal Party, working her way through hard work and talent to win the seat of Willoughby by 170 votes, and then to make it a safe seat, to work her way through the ministry to be really the obvious choice to be Premier. And as she herself put it, a woman with a long name becoming Premier of New South Wales shows it could be done. Beneath all that, though, was this acceptance of corruption that is totally her undoing. It's King Lear, or it's Macbeth in its tragedy. Doesn't mean to say that she is in any way admirable. I think there is a sense she knew, and in fact, as that clip you just played showed, she knew that stuff wasn't right. And instead of dealing with it appropriately, chose to ignore it, but then comes out into the light. And I don't think she has much of an employment future in this country, to be quite honest. She might be lucky and, like Barry O'Farrell, get a diplomat position overseas years after and quietly announced. But I don't know that the good people of New South Wales want someone who has been shown to have been seriously corrupt representing their interests overseas. And whether Optus keep her on, there's talk that they will just quietly let her contract subside, or they may terminate a contract, or they may do nothing. But the point is that a woman who should be a leading figure in Australia, and certainly in New South Wales, is no longer. And perhaps this is why they didn't recommend charges, that she's gone from the very top to the very bottom, and they may have seen that as punishment enough.
And the Liberal Party is still attacking the New South Wales ICAC for their report and for their findings. And the former New South Wales Treasurer, Matt Keane, he's still running a commentary against this decision. And he also ran some negative commentary about the ICAC in the lead up to this decision. And there were all those cutbacks that you referred to the New South Wales ICAC that were made by not just Gladys Berejiklian, but also Mike Baird when he was Premier. The former Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, he attacked the ICAC by claiming that it was a kangaroo court. That was during the last federal election campaign. And we have to remember that the Liberal Party was also considering running Gladys Berejiklian as a candidate in the last federal election. And that would have created a lot of fun if she actually did win and become a federal member of Parliament. And we also have to remember how much support the mainstream media did give to Gladys Berejiklian at that time. All that commentary about Gladys in love, it was just because of a bad boyfriend, and haven't we all been there? Maybe we have, maybe we haven't, and casting doubts on whether there'd be any findings of corruption. Well, they were a little bit right there. It wasn't corruption, it was serious corruption, and they should all be ashamed of the way that they wanted to protect Gladys Berejiklian at that time in 2021. So overall, there's 18 recommendations in the ICAC report. The document is over 600 pages, as you mentioned before, and it's also recommended changes to the political culture of New South Wales, as well as training that should be provided to members of Parliament about corruption. And I thought that if you do need training about what corruption is, and you're a member of Parliament, well, maybe you shouldn't be in Parliament.
And that's the thing. I think that it's so endemic and has been so endemic in New South Wales since forever that they don't know what corruption is. And one of the things that the New South Wales people should be very grateful for is the vision of John Dowd, Attorney General, who set it up. One of the great Liberal figures, I would argue one of the great New South Wales citizens. He set it up so it was unimpeachable. He set it up so it was done properly. And despite the vandalism of later governments, mostly of his own stripe, it's still there. It's hopefully the end of this New South Wales corruption where a handful of people get to decide. One of the figures who seems to have escaped completely scot-free out of this, though his name came up again and again, was the next Premier, Dominic Perrottet, who funded the money for the Wagga Gun Club and the Conservatorium of Music. And I do point you all to the excellent article by Anthony Clan of the Klaxon, who pointed out that the Gun Club has been a financial disaster and a burden on the club. The $5 million has given them a hall that they have to maintain but makes no money. I don't know how they ever thought it was going to make money. One of the things they said that it would be possible is the Invicta Games could hold their shooting events at the hall. Of course, the Invicta Games famously don't have shooting events because it's for veterans. And there are veterans who suffer PTSD and who can't handle the shooting. So it's one of the sports that they don't run. But that was put as one of the great benefits. So already bells should have rung. Cooler head should have prevailed. It's not really to do with Gladys going out with Daryl. It's what Daryl did and how Gladys facilitated it that was the main issue.
You're listening to New Politics. You can subscribe to us on Apple or Google Podcasts, listen through Spotify, YouTube, SoundCloud and Amazon Music, or you can find us at newpolitics.com.au. And you can now support New Politics through Patreon.
And it's fairly well. Oh, to my old lover, I don't expect to see you again.
We don't discuss the war in Ukraine that often on New Politics, but there was a strange turn of events when the leader of the Wagner paramilitary force, Yevgeny Prigozhin, led an insurrection in the Russian city of Rostov-on-Don over the weekend before agreeing to hand over his weapons and flying into exile into Belarus in a deal negotiated by the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko. And many people have suggested that there's as many high-rise apartments in Belarus for Prigozhin to fall out of as there are in Russia. So he's in exile there, but it might not be so safe for him. Now, we're not sure how close this was to a coup in Russia, but as far as a major international event is concerned, it doesn't get much bigger than this. A war in Ukraine that's been going on for almost 18 months, a Russian dictator potentially into his final days, a war in Ukraine that could also ignite a war in Russia, and that's got serious risks for Europe and the rest of the world. But in the Australian media, it was difficult to find out what was going on, and most people who wanted to know about these events in Russia had to go through Twitter and Reddit or try and get access through CNN or Al Jazeera. But I thought that this might have been a world event that was worthy of more coverage than it actually received in Australia.
That 13-year-old Vera rerun needed to happen. And I'm not knocking fans of the show Vera or the show Vera. It's a fine show. It does what it does well. But we could have lived without it, I'm guessing. They weren't even sure which Rostov. There are two Rostovs. One is about 2 hours out of Russia, and Rostov-on-Don, where they finally worked out it was happening, is about 60 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. Both made sense. If you wanted to mobilize a credible threat, a couple of hours out of Moscow made a lot of sense. But how did you get everyone up there? So near the Ukraine made a lot more sense, where everybody was. But again, I remember going to bed on Saturday night thinking tomorrow's going to be a big day. But then it was all over by the time we got up. So I think, too, what we've seen is 3 lots of propaganda clashing with each other. And to be fair, this is maybe why the ABC kept it quiet, because they were trying to work out what can be genuinely presented as news and what has to be rejected as propaganda. You had the Russian propaganda pretty much saying this is ridiculous and nothing's happened and go about your business. You had Ukrainian propaganda, I think, saying that this is the end of Putin. The war here is finished and we've pretty much won it. You had, I guess, 4 propagandas, because you would have had Prigozhin's propaganda saying, we've won, it's going to take a couple of days, but it's all over bar the shouting. And, of course, you had Western propaganda pushing its own views. So there was a lot to unpack and there was a lot to try and work out. And this may be why the ABC didn't do much. But given that they will roll the 24-hour thing on many things that maybe aren't as important, it was a strange choice. Even if you just looked at what you know to be true. The troops have moved into Rostov-on-Don. Speeches have been made. We're going to go back to our regular programming, but if something big happens, we will interrupt it, so be warned. But there was none of that. It was most of the information that I was getting, not all, but most, was coming off Twitter, which was, at least the users of Twitter were trying to cover it in a much more comprehensive and logical way.
Unlike most wars around the world, it's difficult to know exactly what's going on in Ukraine and Russia, and I guess that's why you have international journalists based on the ground over there, and the ABC has got several over there. Russia hasn't really shaken off that micro-control and police state mentality from the time of the Soviet Union, but even still, an event that could weaken the Putin regime or implement some kind of change that could end the war in Ukraine or potentially destabilise the Russian Federation has got great geopolitical ramifications for Europe and the rest of the world. And it's also got ramifications for Australia, even if we don't have a direct political interest or influence in Russia. There's all those supply chain disruptions that have occurred since the war in Ukraine commenced, and it keeps being offered as an excuse for high inflation rates in Australia. And Australia has been involved in offering military support and financial support for the government of Ukraine. There was also that embassy stoush in Canberra, where the building of the new Russian embassy was shut down and they were all told to evacuate. So Australia is involved with this issue in Russia and Ukraine, whether we like it or not.
For sure. And one of the things to remember, that if it was to lead to a world war, if it was to spill over into NATO and then the US were to be involved, you can bet Australia would become involved. Whether it should be or not is a whole other discussion for a whole other podcast. But you could bet that Australia would be committing some level of support to that kind of war. And, of course, if it goes to World War III and the nuclear bombs come out, it's game over, really, for everyone.
And anything could still happen in Russia, so it's possibly reaching its end game. And I could imagine that all of those different regions and republics within the Russian Federation would be watching whatever is developing in Moscow. But whatever the case is, this is still a major international development, but it was not possible to know very much about what was going on through the Australian media. And ABC News was criticised for showing pretty much close to nothing, even though it's meant to be a 24-hour news channel of breaking news. And we have to remember that just during the same week, they showed an extended broadcast of Donald Trump spouting all of his lies and conspiracy theories to the media, even though most of the US media refuses to show Donald Trump at all. And also the ABC published a news article speculating on what a Trump presidency would mean for Anthony Albanese in 2025. So we had this serious analysis and speculation about a hypothetical situation almost 2 years away, which hasn't happened and in my opinion is very unlikely to happen, but a global situation which is happening right now, gets short shrift from a major news outlet. And it wasn't just the ABC. News Corporation had very shallow reporting on events in Russia. And we have to remember that Putin allowed Murdoch into the Russian media market in the early 2000s, and that virtually saved the Murdoch empire at the time. So Putin gives Murdoch a favour in the early 2000s. Murdoch repays the favour by going softly on the Putin regime 20 years later. Now, in Australia, it's not as severe as it is on Fox News in the US, which seems to be a pro-Putin and pro-Russian network, but still it offers some insight into why News Corporation is not reporting too deeply on the events in Russia. And as we know, there's a lot of influence from News Corporation that filters through to the other networks in Australia as well. But I'm just not sure what the case at the ABC would have been. And, you know, I don't want to be too harsh on the ABC and lay the boots in, but maybe they didn't want to pay the weekend rates for their journalists, or maybe they just didn't think that it was relevant to their audience. And they did have some good analysis provided by the journalist John Lyon later on, but that was about it.
It's strange. And when they do call in people, do they call in the foreign minister, Penny Wong, or do they call in the prime minister? No, they call in Simon Birmingham. I mean, okay, I imagine that Penny Wong was probably extremely busy trying to get her head around things and looking at further ramifications and seeing what Australia should and shouldn't do. And again, the Prime Minister, but they have people who can speak for them, and they could throw together a quick, and probably did throw together a quick press release, which could have been used. And then you present that, and then you might go to the shadow. And the other thing too is that the shadow minister pretty much doesn't really oppose foreign policy. So it was an odd choice.
Oh, well, I think it was a very odd choice for Simon Birmingham to be the go-to person for commentary and opinion on Russia. And as you said, not Senator Penny Wong, who is the actual foreign minister, not Richard Marles, who is the defence minister, and not Anthony Albanese, who is the actual prime minister. And I'm not too sure if this is just poor media management on behalf of the federal government, or as you mentioned before, David, that some of these people were just too busy. But you can't be too busy for the media. And and on top of that, I'm not sure if it's just the editors and producers within the mainstream media deciding that the coalition is their natural territory, so they need to keep offering them a voice. But I do think that the federal government needs to start doing something about this, because it undermines their authority and it makes it seem that the coalition is the government when they're actually not. And it's almost like the Labor government has to compete with the opposition to get media time, when it should be the other way around. And it also is happening with Peter Dutton as well, where he was also a go-to person for what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, and just used the opportunity to attack Anthony Albanese for not providing enough support to Ukraine. Now, for these kinds of issues, I think there should be bipartisan support. And just for some context, the Morrison government provided $100 million of support to Ukraine, and the Albanese government has offered around $700 million of support to Ukraine. And that's over a longer period of time. But on a pro rata basis, both the Morrison and the Albanese governments have offered similar levels of financial and military support to Ukraine. But Dutton attacks the government and criticises Anthony Albanese and the Labor government, primarily because he knows no other way. But the media just keeps on running with these sorts of stories.
It's frustrating because, yes, we should hear from the opposition leader. We've heard what the government response or position is first, because that's the one that counts. The opposition leader can promise fairy dust and ponies for everybody, whereas it's the government that has to deal with the real world application. Now, if the opposition leader has better ideas, that's great. But we should know what the idea is that they're opposing before we hear what the opposition is to it. And I don't know if it is because the ABC is infested, as I've seen people say with News Corp people, or whether the Australian media is just so cracked and broken that no one in the media knows any different way.
This is New Politics, one of the top 10 Australian politics and news commentary audio programs. You can listen to us on Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Music, and you can find us at newpolitics.com.au, and you can contribute and support New Politics on Patreon.
The former Labor leader, Simon Crean, died during the week, and he's been remembered as one of the more decent people in federal politics, with tributes coming in from all sides of politics. He was the Labor leader between 2001 and 2003, and he didn't have strong public support. By the time he resigned as leader of the Labor Party, his approval rating was at 17%, and Labor was way behind in the opinion polls. And in politics, that's the sign of success. So his time as opposition leader wasn't seen as being successful, and he was also the only Labor leader in opposition to not lead the party into an election campaign. But he did achieve a lot of reform to the Labor Party behind the scenes to make it more democratic and less dominated by union bureaucrats and more towards the rank and file membership. And this is the stuff that is important for political parties, but the public never sees it or is even interested in it. But the event that Simon Crean is best remembered for is his speech to Parliament during the Iraq War, when he told George W. Bush that the war was a mistake.
Now, the Australian perspective is bound to differ from time to time with the perspective of the United States. And of course, on occasions, friends do disagree, as we did on this side with you on the war in Iraq. But such is the strength of our shared values, our interests, our principles, that those differences can enrich rather than diminish. They can strengthen rather than weaken the partnership. Our commitment to the alliance remains unshakable, as does our commitment to the war on terror. But friends must be honest with each other. Honesty is, after all, the foundation stone of that great Australian value, mateship. Mr. President, the world has changed, but there remains an essential truth in Prime Minister Curtin's words 62 years ago. Australia still looks to America. A truth not just for Australia, but for democracies everywhere. It's a profound historic truth, and which derives its power not from the might of America, but from the democratic promise upon which America was brought forth, conceived and dedicated 227 years ago. The equal rights of all nations, respect for the opinions of all peoples, and the idea that all men are created equal. These principles, taken together, form the true and imperishable basis of the promise of and the friendship between our two great nations. May they never perish from the face of the earth.
And this was one of the best speeches to Parliament, and probably the best speech by a leader of the opposition. It showed courage, it spoke to truth, and in condemning the war and calling it a mistake, and it did take a while for the truth to come out, but I think that Simon Crean was totally vindicated in his position at that time.
It'd be interesting to see if later Labor leaders would have done the same at that time in that position. Possibly Gough Whitlam would have, and did get up and say things like that. Chifley would have. I don't know about Evatt or Colwell. And then for the post-Keating, we only know for sure that one was brave enough, and that was Simon Crean. The others didn't really get to do that type of opposition against the war, although their attitudes to it after was probably telling. Our beloved critics on the left are probably going to point out that Simon Crean lost the SEQEB strike in 1985, opening up to the gig economy, and I acknowledge that. I think Simon Crean, though, didn't get enough credit for reforming the Labor Party. He spent his time, as you mentioned, reforming the party to make it more electable. That the party then went and blew its head off by putting Mark Latham in, who turned out to be one of the worst performing electoral assets to the Labor Party of all time. Probably says more about what was going on in the Labor Party at that time than it does to the quality of Simon Crean's reforms. And again, he was thwarted in a lot of his attempts of reforms. I think he wanted to go further, but you can only go so far.
And Simon Crean will probably end up being a footnote in political history because he didn't take the Labor Party to an election, but he was a significant contributor to the Labor Party and to the union movement. He actually became a minister as soon as he was elected to Parliament in 1990. And he never actually sat on the backbench until that time that he was sacked by Julia Gillard in 2013, and then he left Parliament at the next federal election after that. So he was in politics for some time, and he was a major player during the leadership struggles between Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard between 2010 to 2013, and he was trying to negotiate with the different factions within the Labor Party to try and sort all of those issues out, only for him to be a victim of all of those factional outbreaks. So that was a difficult time for him. It was a difficult time for the Labor Party. We're still trying to work out why they removed not just the one sitting Prime Minister, but two in a row. And didn't they suffer from that for a very long time because of that? But overall, I think Simon Crean made a good contribution to Australian political life. And post-politics, he mainly worked as an industry delegate in business, the livestock industry and manufacturing. And he was seen as an excellent negotiator. He was actually part of a trade delegation in Germany when he died from a heart attack. So he made a big contribution to politics, but also outside of politics as well.
I think when the next history of the Labor Party is written, and there's been a few good ones written, but it's an ever-evolving story. I think Simon, if he doesn't get a chapter of his own, he will certainly play a prominent part in the relevant chapters. I think, yeah, you're probably right. When the broader histories of Australia are written, he'll get maybe a bit more than a footnote, maybe a paragraph. But in terms of Labor history, I think he will leave a bit more of a mark. And we could argue he should have left far more of a mark and been allowed to go to election. John Howard had similar figures and eventually was able to turn those round and win an election. I think it's fair to say that Simon Crean was a victim of the flaws of Labor in terms of small people with big egos not looking at the good of the party.
Supposed to make for better living. Are we better human beings? We've got our wires all crossed. The tubes are all tied, and I'm straining to remember.
And there has been a batch of opinion polling released during the week, and the headline figure of two-party preferred voting is more or less the same as previous opinion polls. It's 54% for Labor and 46% for the Coalition. And there has been a drop in support for the Prime Minister and a slight rise in support for Peter Dutton, although he's still way behind in the preferred Prime Minister rating. Not that that means that much at this point of time. But one issue that should be causing some concern for the federal government is from the latest Essential opinion poll. And that's the question of whether Australia is heading in the right direction. And just after the federal election in May 2022, that figure was 48% of people who said yes, Australia is heading in the right direction, and 27% of people said no. Now, 1 year later, in May 2023, that figure had steadily declined from 48% to 41%, and the no vote had increased steadily from 27% to 38%. And in the last month, it's swung dramatically. Only 33% say that Australia is heading in the right direction, and 47% are saying it's going in the wrong direction. And this is just one metric, and it's difficult to extrapolate this and transfer it directly into voting intentions. But generally, if people are saying that the country is heading in the wrong direction, it usually means that they think the government is heading in the wrong direction as well.
It's an odd sort of, because I might be a communist and think that the country is heading away from the ideals of communism. And at the same time, I might be a neoliberal economist who's thinking, oh no, there's too much government largesse and we're heading in the... So it's one of those things that you can put your own spin on it. And because there's 26 million people in Australia, the wrong direction is, let's call it 15 million after you take out infants, and 15 million directions that could be the wrong one. So it seems to me that if we're going to listen to the polls, it's the consistently higher polling of Labor as doing a good job than the Coalition. A lot of the rest of it, I don't think is terribly meaningful. Now, if that changes, which is what the Coalition wants it to do, that might tell us about how many people are seeing that the country's going in the wrong direction. And probably more importantly, what is the wrong direction?
Oh, that's right, but there's probably been a number of different factors involved here, and pollsters do look for particular changes from month to month, but there's possibly a confluence of events. There's been the housing affordability and access issues that have been prominent over the past few weeks. There's been all of those interest rate rises ever since the Albanese government was elected. There's cost of living pressures. There's been all that negative media coverage of the Voice to Parliament. And if there has been a sharp turn in opinions about whether Australia is heading in the right direction or not, I think it does suggest that the electorate is starting to run out of patience on some of these issues, or maybe all of these issues. And generally, there is a lot of goodwill towards a new government during their first year in office. Tony Abbott is the exception here, where he was almost as popular as herpes just a few months after he won the election in 2013. And the federal government and Anthony Albanese, they're still polling pretty well, but the levels of dissatisfaction have risen dramatically over the past month. And we could say, well, it's only 1 month, let's see what happens next month. But it could also possibly show that the government is not paying enough attention to detail, or there's some inherent contradictions in what they're actually doing. And we've pointed out some of these inherent contradictions in the past. The AUKUS deal, that's a dud. We've talked about that before, and that's estimated to be $368 billion over the next 30 years. So that's around $10 to $15 billion each year. But on social housing, we get $10 billion put into an investment fund to eventually have $500 million spent on much needed social housing. And a lot of people will be thinking, well, $368 billion for AUKUS, but we have to set up an investment fund for social housing. That doesn't make much sense. Stage 3 tax cuts, that's going to cost $313 billion over the next 10 years and mainly favour men and higher income earners. And the politics of this are a lot more complicated than just repealing these tax cuts. And this is also in the context of $1 trillion national government debt. So that's a contradiction that the electorate might be picking up on as well. More funding going to private religious schools when public schools are going without or getting less funding. No changes to negative gearing rules or capital gains tax. The Prime Minister did say that this was an election promise not to make any changes to negative gearing rules or capital gains tax, but governments break promises all the time. And I do think that if there is a good reason for breaking a promise, these decisions can be politically viable as well. Media reform is another area as well. That's probably one issue that's more for Labor supporters and the Greens than the overall electorate, but the government has already ruled this out. And you think, well, what's the Minister for Communications been doing over the past 13 months? Sports betting advertising, that's a complete nuisance for the public, and you'd think that that's a little bit of low-hanging fruit for the government, but they're not even touching that yet. So perhaps this is what's happening in some of the opinion polls at the moment, where people are starting to feel that the government is heading in the wrong direction. There might be a level of impatience out there. The electorate is starting to reduce the benefit of the doubt as well. I don't think it's a problem for the government right now, but the government does need to get on top of these issues, because when it does unravel, it can unravel very quickly.
It's still a relatively new government, 12 months, but it needs to start to learn a bit quicker. Yeah, 3 years to touch gambling advertising. That seems to me a bit excessively long. These things can't change overnight, of course. I know there's been calls for people to stop it, just do a blanket ban from tomorrow. It's not that simple. But 3 years, I think it could be done in probably half that time or even less. You've summarised admirably our objections to the housing issue in terms of using an investment rather than just using government money to build sufficient housing. And again, it's just strange. And they're not using their better communicators. Why isn't Jim Chalmers out there making the economic case? Why isn't Anthony Albanese out there pushing harder for his case? I think the Voice's problem is that the vacuum of silence has been filled. Now, they might be waiting for the official campaign to start, but that could be too late. The only correct answer in the Voice is yes, because it might not be the best thing, but it's the only thing we've got. And if we're serious about reconciliation, if we're serious about looking after our Indigenous population and starting to take them seriously and trying to make amends, the Voice is what we have. And we can make it so that it goes from being okay to being great, but the government needs to keep selling it. It wasn't the government who made it a partisan issue. But it's become a partisan issue. I've seen all kinds of strange and unfounded claims that it's going to take 25 representatives from each state, and there's a building in Canberra where there'll be 150 staff. Nowhere does it say that. The thing that gives me hope is that the book that Thomas Mayo and Kerry O'Brien wrote, The Voice to Parliament, has hit number one. So there's clearly people who aren't listening to the opposition saying there's not enough detail. They're buying it, and people are considering it. And I still think it'll win, but it's going to win despite the efforts of the government, not because of them. And I think that's where the government has to start stepping up. It should start doing things because it's the right thing, not despite the fact that we haven't done anything. People have done the right thing. The public can't be trusted.
Now, I think it's a bit of a cliche, that idea of the political narrative, but governments are storytellers as well. And that's the one thing that the Liberal Party is very good at. And all of it is entirely negative and a lot of it is untrue, but they're still very good at telling a particular sort of story. And after they won the 1996 federal election, we kept on hearing that story about Beasley's $10 billion black hole for almost a full decade. And in the context of the $1 trillion debt left behind by the coalition when they left office last year, $10 billion black hole, well, that's a little bit like losing a $5 note from your side pocket. But we barely hear about this $1 trillion debt. We barely hear about the corruption and the incompetence of the Morrison government. And I know that Stuart Robert has got a few potential corruption issues coming up pretty soon. But if this was the coalition in office now and the situation was reversed, we'd be hearing about this for the next 50 years through a megaphone. Maybe not just one megaphone, but a megaphone each. There'd be 50 megaphones pushing out this message. So that's one part of the political equation. But the other part is to promote a strong narrative about what the government is doing and why they're doing it, and preparing the electorate for any potential broken promises. And as you mentioned, David, they've got a very good political communicator and narrator in Jim Chalmers, but they're not using him effectively. Now, he could be prepping the electorate for changes to the stage 3 tax cuts, or on negative gearing, or on capital gains tax, and push that idea that these are challenging financial circumstances and we can't really afford to do all of these things, and put the Liberal Party back into their box. Now, I realise that all of this is easier said than done, but all we get is weasel words about how stage 3 tax cuts have already been approved, and the negative gearing rules, well, that was decided at the 2019 federal election, so we're not going to change that. But all of that was 4 years ago. Stage 3 tax cuts were actually approved 5 years ago. The circumstances were quite different then, and they're quite different today. As John Maynard Keynes said, when the facts change, you change your mind about things. Decisions that were made 5 years ago might not be relevant today, in the same way the changes and decisions that are made today might not be relevant in 5 years' time. So when the circumstances change, governments need to change as well, and the circumstances have changed quite dramatically in recent times.
Yeah, Keynes also said, in the long run, we're all dead.
Well, that is true.
and both of those are absolutely correct. I mean, I don't know that the government would lose a lot of political capital in saying we're going to roll back the tax cuts. They would with a group of wealthy people who it bothers, but most of them were never going to vote for Labor anyway. So I think mostly the public would say, oh, thank God, here's our money for housing, or here's our money for whatever. It's one less thing. AUKUS, of course, is a bit more difficult to get out of because it's a contract with foreign governments, and Australia's reputation with contracts with foreign governments is bad, and we have to try, and you probably have to take the bad contracts and work with them to show that you're worthy of the good contracts, which is not at all to say AUKUS is a good deal or defensible or anything like that, but it is worth remembering that there's a further context apart from the one that is being pushed in the public. I think the government has to find its confidence. I think that's what it gets down to, that it has to ignore the media that suggests that it's somehow illegitimate. It has to ignore its critics and has to trust its cabinet to do the right thing and let the electorate sort it out in 3 years. And if the electorate don't like it, we might get a minority Teal government or a minority Green government. And that's how democracy works. Just keep going back to the ballot box till you get something you like, and then keep that in till you don't like it any more than put in something else.
Well, maybe the last federal election was an example or a taste of what might happen in future elections, but in the 2022 federal election, people voted for change, and they're possibly not getting the change that they're after. And of course, it wasn't a ringing endorsement of the Labor Party with only 32% of the primary vote in that last federal election, but they did win the election, and now they are the government. And we've criticised the Liberal Party for not getting the message that's been sent to them by the electorate in the last federal election and in many state elections and by-elections over the past 4 years. The message to them is that they have to change their party, otherwise not going to be electable in the future. But it's also the federal Labor Party that doesn't seem to have got the message either. And I think that people do want more change, especially from the younger demographic who have deserted the coalition and are not likely to come back anytime soon. And that demographic has shifted to the Labor Party, and they might keep shifting over to the Greens in the future. So it's not an issue for the federal government right now, I don't think, but their policy development and political behaviour will need to take this shift in demographics into account. And I think that better political communications could address some of these issues. The Housing Future Fund is possibly an issue that Labor could have explained in a much better way, why they've set it up in this particular way, referring to the budget constraints and all of these different issues that are going on. And I think that they would have avoided a lot of the problems that they're currently having on this issue at the moment, instead of the Australian Greens now controlling the agenda on housing issues. And of course, they could have just made the $10 billion available right now instead of setting up a future fund. But it's also possible that the Greens would have complained about it anyway, because this is a key demographic that they wish to target as well. But being in government isn't just about doing the work, developing policy and implementing that policy. It's also about controlling the political agenda as well. And that's something that's lacking. And you mentioned this before, David. We're seeing this with the Voice to Parliament. And I get the sense that Anthony Albanese sees this as an obvious step in reconciliation and just relying on the goodwill of the community rather than forcing the issue and controlling the narrative. And that's just left behind a vacuum that's been filled up with right-wing racists and Liberal Party propagandists. And that should never have been allowed to happen. And that's exactly what's happened with the Housing Future Fund, where a political vacuum was created only for the Greens to be very happy to fill up the space.
Yeah, I'm sure every Green member of Parliament would love to be in government. And I'm sure that they are looking, and this isn't a criticism, every National Party and every One Nation and every Labor person and every independent would love to be in government in some kind of way. So I'm not criticising the Greens when I'm saying they'd love to be in government. What's the point of running for Parliament if you don't think you have a chance of getting your party up into the halls of Treasury, as it were? And they've been kept out of it, but we're seeing these demographic changes. And over the next few years, it may be. I think the Liberal Party's gone. I think it's going to reform in the next 3 to 5 years, maybe sooner. I think Labor may not be far behind. We'll still see a lot of the same faces, don't get me wrong, but they'll be presenting ideas in different ways, in different party structures. Hopefully party structures that are more reflective of modern life. So perhaps what the traditional parties represent is no longer relevant to modern Australian life, which might explain the slow decline in primary vote over the last 6 or 10 elections. The Greens, with their policy of environmentalism, and that's clearly something that is very important to people. Every single Teal candidate got up arguing, and I mean not every right-wing independent, but every Teal candidate got up in part because of their approach to looking after the environment. And that includes who you might call the pre-Teals, and people like Zali Steggall and Rebecca Sharkey, who you could call pre-Teals, who came in with much more liberal but very strong environmental feelings. And I think that's the way that the demographics are going. The Liberal Party is losing older people. As people age, they're not moving to the Liberal Party. They're using their success to try and save the planet rather than to try and maintain the system so others might follow in their footsteps. They're now trying to change the system so that others can follow in their footsteps, if you can see the subtle difference.
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you'd like to support our style of journalism and commentary, please make a donation at our website at newpolitics.com.au. We don't beg, plead, beseech or gaslight you about journalism coming to an end. We just keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.